Hi, Supernaturalist. I just wanted to take the time here to explain the weirdest and scariest situation that I have ever experienced in the 20 years that I've been on this earth. Granted, I live a pretty boring life, just me and my dog now, but this encounter goes to show you and your listeners that anybody, anywhere, can have a paranormal encounter, even someone as normal and boring as myself. I want to tell you all about my childhood friend named Mary. I haven't talked to her in years because of all the badness that she caused my family. She didn't even start off as my friend. She was my sister's friend. But a few weeks into this, it was clear that Mary only wanted to be my friend. You see, Mary isn't like ordinary friends that I've had since then. She wasn't normal at all. Mary was actually a doll, like a stuffed, inanimate doll. But there was definitely something real about her. For starters, let me introduce myself. My name is Jamie. I'm 20 years old and I live in Chicago. I have a brother who's older than me, and a sister that's younger than me. When all this happened, we were living in Oregon, on this small ranch-style house. I was 9 years old at the time, but even though I was so young, I will never forget this situation that my family found itself in. It all started off just fine. My mom brought my sister home a doll that she picked up at a yard sale in town, since my sister was in love with such things. I had a few dolls too, but I'd rather be outside exploring the area or sitting in our tree reading a book. Yeah, I was that kid. Jessie took that damn doll everywhere we went. At first. Jessie would sit the doll, who she called Erica at this point, on the toilet while she took a bath. She put her in bed with her, took her for car rides, took her up the tree when she climbed it, all kinds of things. She looked like any normal stuffed doll to me. She had a dark blue dress on that had a white underlayer. Her body was stuffed, but her feet, hands, and face were all plastic. She was Caucasian and had blonde hair and brown eyes. But her eyes were just creepy, from the get-go. It just felt like they would follow you wherever they went. I'm not talking about the way a poster's eyes follow you because they're looking at the camera either. I'm talking about these eyes almost made you feel like they were looking right at you. Now, before I continue, let me make this clear. I do not think the doll was alive itself. I never once saw Mary actually move on her own. It was more like someone, or even something, was attached to her. And that someone or something had almost zero interest in being my sister's friend. It was about 2 weeks after Mary arrived at our house that Jessie started losing interest in her. I know that kids lose interest in things just as fast as they pick them up, but this was weird. It was like one day she took Mary everywhere, and the next day she put her in the closet and didn't want anything to do with her. She said that she had a bad dream about Mary, and that Mary didn't want to be her friend. She only wanted to be my friend. Jessie is only 15 months younger than me, but her imagination was about 10 times more active than my own. I just told her it was a bad dream, but she said she didn't want Mary anymore, and gave her to me. She actually said to me, "Here, you can have her now. She's all yours." That's when things really started getting weird around the house. You see, I started having dreams about Mary too. At first. I would dream that we were playing, but then all of a sudden, I was in this pitch blackness. I couldn't see anything, and then this voice would come into my head and speak to me. I would never actually hear a voice in my dream, with my ears. It was like telepathy or something. The voice wasn't male or female. It was just a voice. It's kind of hard to explain. It would tell me things like, "I want to have fun with you. We can play together forever. We can be friends. I can be your only friend." I never gave it two thoughts in the beginning. They were just dreams. And even at 9 years old, I knew the difference between dreams and reality. But then I started hearing the voice in my head while I was awake. I remember it plain as day. I can never forget a single detail. I was out in the yard playing catch with our dog Hagrid. I got this thought or something like a thought in my head, even though I don't think it was my own thought. And the thought said, "Bring me outside." I knew immediately that it was Mary that I should bring outside, so I went upstairs and I grabbed her. To this day, I can't explain why I followed the instructions of a doll, especially one that put a thought into my head. I think maybe this thing had some kind of control over me. Nothing else happened after that. Mary just sat there on the lawn chair like a normal doll should. It was only after that day that I started including Mary in my daily life. And I did it just like Jessie would do. I'd bring her with me just to do day-to-day stuff. It was the second day of doing that when I referred to her as Erica, and she told me her name wasn't Erica. It was Mary. And again, it was like I was having these thoughts in my head, but the thoughts weren't my own. So, I started calling her Mary. It wasn't a big deal to my family. They just did as I asked them to. They probably just thought I was being an imaginative kid. I didn't actually put her in bed with me at this point, though. But then one night, I was lying there in bed and got another one of those thoughts. I want to be in your bed. I got up, grabbed her, and put her in bed with me. Then I guess I fell asleep, because I woke up later to my sister crying. We shared a room, so I was the first to hear it, even though my parents still insisted on having a baby monitor in the hallway when we were young. I got up and went over to see her, just to see what was wrong, and she told me she had a really, really bad nightmare. And I actually had her write this next part for you, so she could describe this dream in detail that she's never forgotten. So this next part is actually Jessie writing to you. I remember the dream just like I had it last night, even though it was over a decade ago. I remember this black mass slowly crawling up my legs. It felt like ice-cold hands coming up my legs, and the whole time it was making this hissing sound. I couldn't move or scream, and I could barely breathe because I was so terrified. It made its way up past my legs, over my stomach, and onto my chest. And that's when I started to feel the weight of this thing, and the pressure from it pushing down on me. It was still making the hissing sound, but I could also hear a growling noise too. It got to my throat, and it felt like it wrapped itself around my neck and was trying to strangle me. I don't know if it was actually in the dream, or if it was my brain trying to react to what was happening, but I started to pray, and this thing let up. It was like it crawled back down my body super fast, and left at the foot of my bed. I woke up and immediately started crying. I was only 7 years old when this happened. So after Jessie's nightmare, Mom and Dad came in and tried to calm her down, but she was still really scared. She asked me if she could sleep in bed with me, and before I could even tell her yes, that voice in my head said no. So I told her that she should sleep in our parents' room that night. She went with them. I went back into my bed and fell asleep with Mary at my side. It was after that night that the activity ramped up. A lot. My sister started having nightmares on a regular basis, almost always the same one with the darkness crawling up her body. But then my brother started having them too. I tried to get him to write up what he saw, but he doesn't remember them as well, and thinks his brain was blocking them out because they were so scary, even to this day. He told me back then that there were dreams where he was stuck in the house and it was on fire, and other nights he had dreams of twisted faces and claws trying to get him. It was really horrible stuff, and I was glad that I didn't have any of those nightmares. I could tell that my brother was scared when he told me this, because he was glancing around every so often, like he was making sure no one else was listening to us or something. He's 2 years older than me, and he was always the brave one out of the three of us, so it kind of creeped me out, to be honest. I heard my parents talking one night about the nightmares that Jessie and Junior were having, and they were concerned that they were reacting off of each other and getting each other worked up enough to have continued bad dreams. I never had one single nightmare the whole time this was going on, but Junior and Jesse would have them about twice a week, each. Sometimes on the same night as each other, sometimes on different nights than each other. But they would never have them at the exact same time of night. And then other things started happening too. To all of us. We started seeing these shadows around the house, like they would dart off around the corner or down the hall or into another room. They always seemed to be right out of our view, like we just missed whatever was making the shadow. Even my mom and dad started seeing them, which really didn't help the situation in my eyes. At first, I could blame my siblings for their imaginations, and then when I started seeing the shadows, I could blame them for getting in my head. But when my parents would both look at the exact same spot at the exact same time and give each other a "what the hell was that" glance, I couldn't blame my imagination or my siblings' imaginations anymore. Something was really weird in our home. And then there were the whispers. It was like if we were in the living room downstairs, the whispers sounded like they were coming from above your head. They weren't very loud, but you could definitely hear them, even though I could never make out what they were saying. It never sounded like there was more than one person whispering at a time either. I think there was only one thing responsible for them. It wasn't like it was having a conversation with another one. It was like it was trying to talk with whoever was in the room at the time. And the voices continued in my head. I would think things like, "Come play with me. I'll keep you safe. Don't leave me alone." With all the weird stuff in my house, the promises of having a friend and being kept safe actually made me feel better. I know I was naive about everything, but I was only 9 years old. I didn't put two and two together yet, that Mary could be the one responsible for all of this crap going on in the house. Then, these bad odors started appearing out of nowhere. Like rotting meat, rotting eggs, smoke, stuff like that. They would literally come and go in an instant sometimes. You could never follow the smell. It was always just in one spot. I remember one time, my mom walked into the living room and walked through what she described as burnt meat. But when she tried to follow the smell, it was just gone. But she was absolutely positive she smelt burnt meat. Another time, my dad was so positive that he smelled something burning that he ran around the house making sure there wasn't a fire. My parents wouldn't talk about what was going on in the house, at least with us. They told us later in life that they didn't want to scare us, but they knew something was wrong. Since it wasn't hurting anyone though, they didn't have the thoughts of moving or anything like that. They knew they needed to do something though, and they would talk about it at night after we went to bed. My dad told me that every time they talked about the house, he would have terrible dreams of being held down in bed and not being able to move any part of his body. He would call out to my mom, but he couldn't make any noises, and no words would come out of his mouth. One particularly frightening incident happened when we were all in the living room after dinner. My dad, sister, and brother all saw the shadow thing dart around the corner into the dining room at the same time. I saw their reaction and turned to look, but I didn't actually see anything. And right after that, there was this crash from the kitchen, like shattering glass. My parents ran in there to see what happened and told us to stay in the living room, but naturally none of us did. In the kitchen were 2 broken plates on the ground. They were the plates we had just used for dinner, and my mom swears that they were in the sink. The other 3 plates were still in the sink actually, and none of them were broken. But these 2 had somehow come out of the sink and fell to the floor. I saw the looks my parents were exchanging, and I knew they were scared. As we were standing there, all 5 of us smelled this awful smell at the same time, like rotting eggs. I remember my brother asking them what was happening, and I remember the tears in his eyes. My parents told us that everything was going to be okay, and that they were going to figure out what was going on in the house. I asked them if the house was haunted, and all they could say was that they didn't know, That was the first night I think I was troubled by Mary. You see, that was the first night she ended up being somewhere that I know I didn't leave her. When I went down to dinner, I know I left her on the floor, and my other toys were still there that I was playing with. But when I came back, after the plate incident, Mary was on my bed, lying down like she was sleeping with her head on a pillow, or like she was propped up relaxing. I asked Jessie if she did that, and she told me no. She didn't touch Mary. I know it wasn't anyone else in the house either, since they were all already downstairs for dinner, and I'd been with them the entire time since then. I decided that night I wasn't going to sleep with Mary, and in fact, I put her in the closet because I was really creeped out. I remember as I laid there, drifting off to sleep, I heard that voice in my head again. "I'm scared of the closet. Please come get me." I didn't. I left her there. And I think that's why things got so much worse after that. The next morning, my dad woke up with these scratches on his leg that looked like claw marks. This thing was starting to get physical with us. At first, my dad refused to admit that something had scratched him, and kept telling us that he must have done it on a bush that day, or scratched himself while he was sleeping, or something. When I was older, he told me he didn't want to give this thing any power by acknowledging it, even though he knew deep down that it had to be something like that that scratched him. I brought Mary out of the closet and stared at her, trying to see if she would move on her own. But she didn't, so I decided she wasn't the culprit. That I imagined those thoughts when she was in the closet. That it was just my imagination. But Mary just kept appearing in places that she shouldn't. In the living room when I'd put her upstairs when I would leave her downstairs, in my bed, on our toy box. Finally, I couldn't keep denying it, and I shoved her in the toy box and closed the lid. It had a latch on it that I was certain could keep her in there if she was really moving around on her own, even though still I had never witnessed her moving around on her own. One night, again, as all of us were in the living room, all 5 of us heard what sounded like a kid's footsteps running around upstairs. It was clear as day. My parents ran up there, this time threatening punishment if we followed. That was one of the scariest parts of all of this. Waiting downstairs as my parents were upstairs dealing with only God knew what. Jessie was so scared she was crying. Junior was standing at the bottom of the steps calling out to them about what was happening. I just stood there, shaking, fighting back tears of my own, and trying to figure out what to do with Mary, who I was sure was the one making the noises upstairs. Then I heard this laughing sound, even though no one else heard it. It sounded like a little kid to me, but it was enough to send me into a screaming frenzy. I have never seen my parents come down those stairs that fast. In fact, I didn't even know my parents could move that fast. When I started screaming, I scared the hell out of Junior and Jessie, and they started screaming too. My parents basically took 2 or 3 steps from the upstairs to the downstairs, and they grabbed all 3 of us, asking what was happening. Junior and Jessie just looked at me, and I told them all about the laughing that I heard. I broke into tears and finally told all of them about what I had been experiencing with Mary over the past couple of days. My dad marched right upstairs, grabbed that doll and threw it in the garbage can outside. But as he did, he winced and grabbed his arm. And then when we looked, there was a welt that started to actually look like a bite mark to us. I guess enough was enough for my parents, because they packed up some of our stuff for us that night, and we ended up taking a vacation for a week. It wasn't a fun vacation, it was just full of fear and worry. My parents would talk super low when we were around, and would always make sure that we were sleeping if they wanted to have big discussions about what was going on in the house. We ended up just staying with my grandma that entire time. My parents ended up contacting this medium lady named Rachel. I never learned her last name for some reason, and we weren't allowed at the house while she was there. Only my parents were there, so I don't know the whole story of what happened, just what my parents told us afterwards, and what they added when we were older. Rachel the medium confirmed that something had invaded our house and was, in fact, attached to that doll, but it was not a human spirit. It was something else called an inhuman spirit. Basically, it was wreaking havoc on our family because that's what they do, and it had a focus on me for some reason. It didn't like my sister, and that's why it moved on to me and communicated with me. It was responsible for everything that we were experiencing. She said we had to rid ourselves of everything that could keep Mary attached to the place, like the hairbrush that we used to comb her, for example. She was in contact with people that could contain whatever the hell the spirit was, and she took Mary with her that night, who, by the way, was sitting propped up on the side of the garbage can when they came back. That's how they found her. I don't think anybody took her out of the garbage can. I think she did it herself. Rachel also told my parents something else. That her name was not Mary. But she wouldn't even say the name out loud of what it was really called. We hung up a bunch of crosses on the safe side, even though Rachel told us that removing Mary from our house and giving her to the people that knew how to deal with her would be enough to bring harmony back to our lives and get rid of all the paranormal activity. I still put crosses up to this day. Whatever she did worked, because after that, we never had one more paranormal event in our lives. We moved out of that house 2 years later and headed to Washington, and then I moved to Chicago for college when I turned 18. I often wondered now, since I've read a lot about the subject, if Rachel had taken Mary to the Warrens. I'm sure that would be too much of a coincidence, though. It was probably just some other person that knew how to deal with it. I can tell you this, though. Some of the things that are on those haunted doll movies are too close for home for me to enjoy to watch them. I watched the first one, but I refuse to watch any of the other ones. I don't need to watch it when I lived it. Have a good night.